okay? I'm going to talk about monetary and fiscal policy. I'm going to talk about a problem that many of us are likely to be aware of. But the message and the answer are going to be the same as what I've already said, which is that you need to know what are the right parameters, i.e. they're called technically the relevant parameters, and then you have to regulate the system according to those parameters. So here is GDP, US GDP up until early tens. So I don't know, something about half a dozen years ago. And we can see the financial crisis, that's the dip up near the top. Let's talk about how people think about regulation of this growth. There is something called the interest rate. The interest rate is regulated by the Federal Reserve Bank. The Federal Reserve Bank looks at the interest, at the inflation, right? But their model of the world is that there is this long-run natural interest rate that somehow is a property of the system. And what they're worried about is not this long-run natural interest rate, but the fluctuations that go up and down around it. And the reason is because if the interest rate is the long-run value, then GDP is growing at a good rate of 4 to 5%. Maybe that's exaggerated these days. Unemployment is low, inflation is moderate, and everything is going okay. If inflation goes up, there's something called overheating. What we want to do is to increase interest rates in order to reduce the inflation so that that isn't happening. If unemployment goes up and inflation goes down, that's a recession. Then we want to decrease interest rates. And as long as we do this in the right way, by paying attention, we will be okay. This is the idea. Now, I'm going to tell you about a different theory. This different theory, I'm then going to analyze data about and show you that it actually works better from the data that we will collect and talk about. And in this theory, we have financial flows that are going through the system. There are two different financial flows. And again, I don't have a mouse arrow, so I'm going to just describe this. So there's a left loop. The left loop is the following loop. People get paid and they use that money to buy stuff. Pretty straightforward loop. In the right loop, people invest, that's the top arrow coming back to firms, and the firms spend that money on building stuff like factories and buying equipment. So that's that inner loop. And then the returns on the investment go back to the capital, right? That's the people who are the owners of these companies in one way or another. There's also money flows to banks, which we will talk about a little bit, and there's money flows to the government. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus particularly on these two loops. I'm going to show you that they actually are loops, and that this is an important behavior of the economy. So these are all of these arrows, including the ones that I said I wouldn't be too focused on over time. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to normalize them so that the growth itself is taken out of the picture. And so I'm summing all of them up and dividing it. And what you will see is that what I called the left loop, the consumption and wages loop, is the biggest loop. That's at the top, the blue and the orange. And the investment and returns is the next. And then there are all of these other ones. Okay. Now, what I want to do is point out that there is a change that happens. And the change that happened is about 1980. You see that? There's kind of a behavior shift. And so if there's a behavior shift, that's kind of important. So we can focus on that to pull out the ideas of this analysis. And in order to do that, I'm just going to write down the fraction of the firm spending, which is the labor part, paid to people for doing the work. And what we see is there is clearly a shift in 1980, early 80s, and then a new behavior thereafter. So we want to analyze this. So I'm going to go through a little bit of the analysis and put some pictures out here. And in order to illustrate this, what we really are doing is we're looking at the closure conditions on these loops. So these are the money flows that are going actually to the banks, make it easy to figure out what's happening. So what we're looking in the top left is labor borrowing. And in the top left and in the bottom left is the labor total savings. So that's the accumulation of labor borrowing with a negative sign. And what we see is that at 1980, roughly, or a few years later, labor borrowing became positive. Before that, it became negative, which means people were savings. But after that, people were borrowing. And that number increased until it's getting close to $1 trillion a year. And the accumulation of that number as of 2000 and whatever it was, 15 or so when we did this, was about $14 trillion of debt. On the right, we have the capital borrowing. And what we see is that before 1980, this was positive, i.e. capital was borrowing. And afterwards, it was negative, meaning that they're not borrowing their savings. And the accumulation of cash by capital is on the order of $5 trillion, okay, as of 2015. So there's a shift in that. And the other thing that we can look at is interest rates, which is very fascinating behavior, right? Because what we see is that up until 1980 it was growing. In fact, there was a crisis at the time. Interest rates went too high. And so after this period, the interest rates declined. And in fact, as of this analysis, they were basically in the range of being negative, actual interest rates, according to this picture. Now, I'm including here, of course, pandemic and the influence of it on the economy. That's a different story that we have not done this analysis for. But what I want to do is I want to show you that what this picture represents is a shift of regime. There are two different regimes. In one regime, the loop, which is the flow on the left, the wages and consumption loop, is, let's call it, unbalanced with the capital loop. It's too big. So to say it differently, and let me try to explain this briefly, when you have these two different loops, it makes sense to say that there needs to be a balance between them. There's a ratio between them where things are going well. And when one of them is too large, then it's not working well. And when the other one is too large, it's not working well. And what I'm going to claim is that in 1980, we shifted from one of them being too large to the other one being too large. Okay? So in the previous regime, we had too much money flowing in the capital and wages loop and not enough money flowing in the investment returns loop. And that created inflation the way we have been talking about it. So interest rate increases because there is too much money going after too few products. Why too few products? Because there's not enough capital to create the equipment and the infrastructure in order to produce what's being and capital is borrowing because it makes sense to borrow in order to build stuff, even though you're paying interest on the money. The labor limited regime is the other way around. The labor limited regime is that there's too much money flowing in the capital loop and not enough money flowing in the labor loop. And in that case, what happens? The interest rate is decreasing. There's not enough money to buy stuff, and capital is saving money. Why aren't they investing it in building stuff? And the reason that they're not investing in building stuff is because nobody has enough money to buy it. Now, in order to show you that this is, we can confirm, if you will, this theory, what I've done here is I've drawn these two critical parameters, the investment and the consumption, against each other. And what we have here is this dynamics, which, let me just explain it the following way. We have two parameters in the system. but we're only actually regulating one of them in a knowledgeable way. And you cannot control a 2-parameter system with a 1-parameter controller. It doesn't work. There have to be 2 parameters controlling a 2-parameter system in order for it to work. And what we see here is the following, that over time, these red dots are the recessions over a period of, 40 years, something like that. And so what we're seeing is that the system is running in to the wall of the possible ratios of the consumption to investment. And when it runs into them, the manifestation is a recession. So the interest rates are being shifted. That injects money into some money at least, into the consumption loop. And then it goes again around until it once again runs into the wall. So this is a really, really poor regulator because it only has 1 parameter to regulate a 2-parameter system. And maybe one can argue that it's doing the best that it can, given that constraint. Again, what we really need to do is pay attention to this ratio and control the ratio so that we're not running into the wall. And in fact, we are building a more and more rapid, if that's the assumed goal, of the economy through growth to the upper right, rather than doing this kind of meandering path, which ends up running into walls. The fact that these red dots line up on a single line is proof that there are only 2 parameters that matter, right? Because if there are other parameters that are surely varying in the system, then you wouldn't have the same ratio at which the recessions occurred. And again, going back to the earlier data, we really see that these 2 loops are dominating the economy. The other ones may be important, but they're important at second order. So we can, this is what normalization group does, strip away those finer scale details, focus on the largest scale details, and make sure that we get that part right. Okay, so we've done the analytics. We came up with the analysis. We showed that, in fact, these are the most important parameters based upon that analysis. What we've proven is that if we don't know what the right parameters are, we're sunk. We're not doing the right thing. And does this matter? Yes, it's huge in terms of its impact on economic activity, well-being of the economy, poverty, and all of those things that economics cares about, or people care that economics cares about.